There is a house on the banks of the Mississippi that the locals refuse to name after dark. Travelers passing along the river road still point to it from a distance, never closer, and speak of it only as the house that devours its owners. Vines have swallowed half its columns. The windows, what remains of them, stare out like hollow eyes over fields that once grew the whitest cotton in the parish. But before it became a ruin, before it became a legend whispered over coffee in nearby towns, it was simply a home built for ambition, for status, for a marriage that was supposed to be perfect. In the autumn of 1853, a woman named Eleanor Whitfield arrived at that mansion as a bride. She was 26 years old, raised in New Orleans society and famous, even before she crossed the threshold, for a kind of beauty people in that era called dangerous. Within 2 years, Eleanor would vanish without a trace, and the mansion would begin its slow descent into the ruin you can still see today. What happened inside those walls has never been fully explained. Some say it was jealousy that consumed her. Others say the house itself turned against her. By the end of the story, you will have heard both versions, and you may find yourself unable to decide which one frightens you more. This is the story of Eleanor Whitfield, and the price she paid for being unforgettable. The plantation sat 2 miles outside the town of Belle Riviere, Louisiana, on a bend of the Mississippi where the current slowed and the fog gathered thick most mornings. The mansion itself had been built 30 years earlier by Augustus Whitfield, a man whose fortune came from cotton and whose name carried weight in every parlor from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. By 1853, that fortune belonged to his son, Bartholomew Whitfield, a widower of 41 who had spent the 3 years since his first wife's death running the plantation alone, raising 2 children, and fending off the persistent matchmaking of his older sister, Constance. Constance Whitfield had never married. She had lived in the mansion since childhood, and in the years since her brother's wife had died, she had become the undisputed mistress of the household, overseeing the staff, managing the social calendar, deciding which families were invited to dinner and which were quietly excluded. She ran the house the way a general runs a campaign, and she did it well. The servants respected her. The town respected her. And when her brother announced, in the summer of 1853, that he intended to remarry, Constance smiled at the dinner table and offered her congratulations. What she felt privately was something else entirely. Eleanor arrived in October, and the household staff would later say that the air itself seemed to change the moment her carriage came up the drive. She stepped down in a traveling dress of deep blue, her dark hair pinned beneath a small hat, and even after a full day's journey by riverboat and carriage, she looked as though she had stepped out of a painting. Bartholomew had met her at a ball in New Orleans only 4 months earlier, and those who witnessed the courtship said he had been transformed by her. A serious, quiet man suddenly laughing at parties, suddenly attentive in a way his late wife's friends found almost startling. The wedding had been small, held in New Orleans, and by the time Eleanor arrived at the plantation as its new mistress, the marriage was already a settled fact. What was not settled was how the household would receive her. Constance greeted her new sister-in-law at the door with perfect courtesy. "Welcome to Belle Riviere," she said, and the words were warm enough that no one watching would have suspected anything beneath them. But that night, alone with her lady's maid, Constance said something different. "She will not last a season," she told the maid, a young enslaved woman named Delphine who had served the Whitfield household since girlhood. "Women like that never do. They burn too bright and then they burn out and the rest of us are left to clean up the ash." Delphine said nothing. She had learned, in her years in that house, that saying nothing was almost always the wiser choice. The first weeks were, on the surface, peaceful. Eleanor settled into the rhythms of plantation life, the early mornings, the heavy heat of Louisiana afternoons, the rituals of supervising a household staff far larger than anything she had managed in New Orleans. She was, by every account, a quick study. She learned the names of every servant within days. She learned which fields produced the best yield and which overseers needed watching. Bartholomew, delighted by her competence, began including her in conversations about the plantation's finances. Conversations that had, for 3 years, belonged exclusively to Constance. It was a small shift, a handful of decisions redirected from one woman to another. But in a household built on hierarchy and precedent, small shifts were never small for long. By December, the tension between the two women had a name among the staff, though no one dared speak it aloud near either of them. They called it, simply, the Cold War of the parlor. Constance began holding her own dinners on evenings when Eleanor was occupied elsewhere, quietly excluding her from social plans, ensuring that certain invitations from town families arrived addressed only to Miss Constance Whitfield and her brother, as though Eleanor did not exist. Eleanor, for her part, began making small changes to the household that undercut Constance's authority without ever directly confronting her. Rearranging furniture Constance had chosen, changing menus Constance had approved, redirecting household funds toward projects Eleanor preferred. Neither woman ever raised her voice. That was not how women of their class fought. They fought with seating arrangements and unanswered letters, with compliments that contained quiet insults, with silences that lasted exactly as long as necessary to make a point. The town noticed. By January, Belle Riviere society had taken sides, and dinner parties across the parish buzzed with speculation about the Whitfield household. Some families sided with Constance, whom they had known for years and whose judgment they trusted. Others were drawn to Eleanor's charm, her wit, the way she could make even the dullest planter's wife feel like the most interesting woman in the room. Eleanor's beauty, which had once seemed simply a fact about her, began to take on a different character in the gossip of the parish. People spoke of it now as though it were a weapon, a tool she used deliberately to disarm husbands and unsettle wives. It was an unfair characterization, and Eleanor knew it. But she also understood, with the particular clarity of someone raised in New Orleans society, that fairness had very little to do with how a woman's reputation was decided. By February, things in the house had grown sharp enough that even Bartholomew, a man not naturally attuned to social undercurrents, began to notice. He found himself increasingly caught between two women he loved in entirely different ways. His wife, whom he adored with the particular intensity of a man rediscovering happiness after grief, and his sister, who had run his household and raised his children through the darkest years of his life. He tried, clumsily, to mediate. It did not go well. Both women assured him nothing was wrong, and both women meant it as a kindness, and both women were lying. What's your take on the situation so far between Eleanor and Constance? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments before we continue. It was in March, with the first hint of spring warming the Louisiana air, that Eleanor began to notice something strange in the west wing of the house. The west wing was the oldest part of the mansion, built during Augustus Whitfield's original construction and left largely unused since his death. It housed a handful of guest rooms, a disused study, and a long gallery hung with portraits of Whitfield ancestors going back 3 generations. Eleanor had wandered there one afternoon while exploring the house. She still found new rooms occasionally. The mansion was large enough to swallow whole sections of itself, and had paused in front of a portrait of a woman she didn't recognize. "Who is this?" she'd asked Delphine, who had been passing through with an armload of linens. Delphine had hesitated before answering. "That's Mrs. Augustus Whitfield, the first one. Master Augustus's first wife." "The first one? There were others?" "There were 2 more after her," Delphine said carefully. "None of them lasted long in this house." Eleanor had laughed at the time, assuming Delphine meant simply that the women had died young, as so many did in that era, from fever or childbirth or the thousand small dangers of 19th-century life. But something in Delphine's tone had stayed with her, and in the weeks that followed, Eleanor found herself returning to that gallery more than once, studying the painted faces of the women who had come before her. The strangeness began gradually. A mirror in her dressing room that seemed, in certain light, to hold a fog behind the glass that didn't match the room reflected in front of it. A cold patch of air in the upstairs hallway that persisted even as the Louisiana spring grew warmer outside. And then, one night in late March, a sound, distant, indistinct, but unmistakably a woman's voice, coming from somewhere in the unused rooms of the West Wing, where no one was supposed to be. Eleanor told no one at first. She told herself it was nerves, the strain of months of social warfare with Constance finally catching up with her. But the servants, she began to notice, reacted oddly whenever the West Wing came up in conversation. A quick change of subject, a glance exchanged between 2 maids, a story half told and then abandoned. When she finally pressed Delphine directly, the young woman's composure cracked for just a moment. "This house remembers things, Mrs. Whitfield," Delphine said quietly. "It doesn't let go of women easily. None of the ones who came before you left this house peacefully. Mrs. Augustus the first died in childbirth in that west wing. The second one fell down the main staircase and broke her neck, though there were those who said she didn't fall on her own. The third left in the night and was never heard from again, and Master Augustus never spoke of her, not once, for the rest of his life." "And you're telling me this house is haunted by them?" Delphine's silence was answer enough. "I want to take a moment here to say something to you, the viewer watching this video right now. Thank you, genuinely, for staying with this story as far as Chapter 3. I know historical mysteries like this one ask a lot of your attention, and the fact that you're still here, still listening, means more than you know. And I promise you, the best and the most chilling part of Eleanor's story is still ahead of us." April brought the rains, and with them, a strange illness that swept briefly through the household staff. Nothing serious, a fever that came and went within days for most who caught it, but it left the house tense and watchful. It was during this period that Bartholomew, working late one evening in his late father's old study, finally went looking for answers about the women Delphine had mentioned. What he found, buried in a strongbox his father had left behind, was a collection of letters, correspondence between Augustus Whitfield and a New Orleans physician, written across more than a decade. The letters painted a picture far darker than anything the polite version of Whitfield family history had ever acknowledged. Augustus's first wife had indeed died in childbirth, but the physician's letter suggested complications that might have been treated, had Augustus called for help sooner. He had not, the letters implied, because he had grown tired of her by then, and her death had been, in the physician's careful and damning phrasing, perhaps not entirely unwelcome to him. The second wife's death on the staircase was described even more bluntly. The physician who examined her body had noted bruising on her arms inconsistent with a simple fall. Bruising, he wrote, that suggested she had been held, or pushed, by someone with considerable strength. He had been paid, the letters made clear, a substantial sum to record her death as an accident. The third wife's disappearance was the strangest of all. The physician's final letter on the subject, dated some 15 years before Bartholomew now sat reading it, described visiting the house at Augustus's request to examine a woman suffering from what the physician called a derangement of the nerves brought on by isolation and cruelty. The letter recommended she be sent away to recover. 3 weeks later, a final note from Augustus himself, found tucked behind the physician's letters, stated simply that the matter had been resolved, and that the household staff had been instructed never to speak of Mrs. Whitfield again. Bartholomew sat in his father's study long into the night, the rain hammering against the windows, understanding for the first time the true nature of the inheritance he had received. The mansion was not simply built on cotton money. It was built on a pattern of beautiful women brought into this house and slowly, deliberately, destroyed by a man who could not tolerate sharing his life, his attention, or his power with anyone who might rival him. And as he sat there, a colder thought took hold of him. His father was gone. But the pattern, the house, the legacy of cruelty dressed up as Southern gentility, had it truly ended with Augustus's death? Or had it simply been waiting, patient as the river outside, for the right combination of jealousy and opportunity to wake it again? He thought of his sister Constance, who had run this house for years with absolute authority. He thought of his wife Eleanor, whose presence had upended that authority in ways neither woman had ever said aloud. And for the first time, Bartholomew felt something he had never expected to feel in his own home: fear. The final weeks of Eleanor's time at Belle Riviere unfolded with a speed that no one in the household could later fully explain. Bartholomew, unsettled by what he'd discovered, began watching his sister and his wife with a new and uncomfortable attentiveness. He noticed things he had previously dismissed: the precise timing of Constance's absences whenever Eleanor reported feeling unwell, the particular tea Constance always insisted on preparing herself for Eleanor on the evenings when Eleanor's headaches grew worse, the way the servants seemed to flinch whenever Constance entered the West Wing alone. He confronted his sister directly on the 2nd of May, in the privacy of the old study, the same letters from his father spread across the desk between them. Constance's reaction, by every account that survives from that conversation, was not denial. It was something closer to relief, the relief, perhaps, of a long-held silence finally being broken. "You think I'm doing what Father did," she said. "I'm not him, Bartholomew. I would never harm her. I only wanted my place back. The place I earned, running this house through your grief, raising your children when their own mother was gone." And then she arrived, with her New Orleans manners and her New Orleans face. And within months it was as though I had never existed in this house at all. What exactly Constance had done, and what she had not, remains the most disputed part of the entire Whitfield story. Some accounts, and there are several versions passed down through Belle Riviere families over generations, claim Constance had been slowly poisoning Eleanor's tea for weeks, not enough to kill her, but enough to weaken her, to make her seem fragile and unwell so that Bartholomew's attention and concern would shift away from his wife's vibrant confidence and back toward something he could protect rather than admire. Other versions claim the illness was never poison at all, but something closer to what the old physician had once called a derangement of the nerves. The simple, devastating psychological toll of being isolated, undermined, and quietly hated within the walls of one's own home. What is agreed upon across every version of the story is what happened on the night of May 9, 1853. Eleanor was found missing from her bed shortly after dawn. Her dressing room window stood open. Her traveling cloak was gone from its hook. And in the gallery of the West Wing, beneath the portrait of Augustus Whitfield's first wife, searchers found a single item: Eleanor's wedding ring, removed from her hand and placed deliberately on the floor, as though she had chosen, in her final act inside that house, to leave behind everything it had given her. She was never found. Search parties combed the riverbank for weeks. Rumors traveled faster than facts: that she had drowned in the Mississippi, that she had fled north with help from sympathetic servants, that the house itself had simply taken her, the way it had taken 3 women before her. Bartholomew, by all accounts, was never the same man again. He sent Constance away within the year, to live with distant cousins in Mobile, and he himself rarely left the mansion's grounds for the remainder of his life, dying 12 years later alone in the same study where he had read his father's letters. The mansion passed through 2 more owners in the decades that followed, and each, in turn, abandoned it, citing reasons that ranged from financial ruin to, in one case, a written account left by the final owner's daughter describing voices in the West Wing and a cold presence on the main staircase that she said followed her from room to room. Today, the house stands empty, slowly surrendering to the river air and the slow patience of Spanish moss. Local historians have tried, periodically, to verify the full truth of Eleanor Whitfield's disappearance, but the physician's letters were lost sometime in the early 20th century, and the Whitfield family line itself ended with Bartholomew's children, neither of whom had children of their own. What remains is the house, the legend, and the unanswered question that has haunted Belle Riviere for over a century and a half. Did Eleanor escape a house built on cruelty, or did that same house finally claim her, the way it had claimed every beautiful, unwelcome woman who dared to call it home? What do you believe really happened to Eleanor that night? Did she escape, or did the house take her, just as it took the women before her? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss the next chapter of Forgotten History. And if you're hungry for more stories like this one, we have another video waiting for you right now that we think you're going to love. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.